The title of these videos is Why Teach the Holocaust? And the subtitle for this particular segment is Why Write Poetry About the Holocaust? Why read poetry about the Holocaust? William Hann, my friend and colleague for 37 years, has come to every class that I've taught on the literature of the Holocaust, which has been for 12 years. So this is his 27th guest appearance. His presentations are revelations about poetry, how to listen, how to read it, how to teach it. They're explorations of the Holocaust which reach an extraordinary number of students, teachers and students and their students who remember them for years afterwards. He's a very distinguished poet. He's Professor of English and Poet Emeritus in Residence at SUNY Brockport. He was Fulbright Lecturer in American Literature in Germany. He's had an NEA and a Guggenheim. He's been published in over 300 periodicals. He has most distinguished collections about the Holocaust, one of which was a finalist for the 2004 National Book Award. Of his Holocaust poetry, Archibald MacLeish wrote, a surprisingly powerful book, surprising because we think of the Nazi attempt to exterminate the Jews as horrors, which have now receded into a nightmare past. Hann, because he is truly a poet, knows better that it is a horror which will never renew itself, which will renew itself over and over again as long as human beings ask the inescapable question, what is man? For it is this question which haunts these poems. Hann is himself an American, but he is an American who is the son of Germans of the generation which produced the Nazis and the nephew of a Nazi flyer shot down over Russia. And the question, what is man, becomes for him the more agonizing question, what am I? This question only poetry can answer, and poetry only when it is written with discipline and honesty and courage and restraint. So I'm going to ask William Hann to begin by reading a poem.
Thank you, Peter. Good to be here with you folks. This is a fairly simple, straightforward lyric about a child and the Nazi, the German killing machine. The bear was alone, was carrying her bear with her, was alone, was carrying her bear with her, was alone, was carrying her bear with her, bear to counsel, comfort, and protect her. Arrived with 1,000 other children, given toys to keep them quiet, was alone, was carrying her bear with her, was alone, was carrying her bear with her. In the gas, her bear clawed free of her. In the gas, her bear clawed free of her. She held her bear as tightly as she could, but in the gas, her bear clawed free of her. The mind and heart of her bear are wool. The mind and heart of her bear are wool. Its eyes black and shiny as tiny mirrors. Her bear is stuffed with wool. Was alone, was carrying her bear with her. Its eyes black and shiny as tiny mirrors. Its heart wool, its mind wool. Was alone, was carrying her bear with her. I wrote that poem and it came along fairly fast, maybe, I don't know, 5, 10, 15 years ago. But as Peter knows, about a month ago I wrote another Holocaust poem. Every time I think I'm done writing them, and even want to be done writing them, another one seems to grab hold. But here's a more complex poem that I'm trying still to understand. You mentioned Archibald MacLeish. He says our own poems have to be smarter than we are. They go on writing themselves. And I like that idea of a compact language wherein new meanings will continue to reside. And anyway, this is called Museum Visitor Coda. I don't even have this typed up yet, but I've been over it quite often. Museum Visitor Coda. I was reading a wonderful book by Raoul Hilberg called The Politics of Memory. He mentions that he tried to suggest to people when they set up the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington that they have a room, in which there would be a single artifact, a can of Zyklon B on a pedestal. The Zyklon B being the gas. It came in bluish pellets, I understand, that was dropped into the chambers. And he thought that this would stand as the artifact to represent 20th century Germany. And that's all he wanted in the room. Well, and he just mentions it quickly, and then I dwelled on it, I guess, and then this showed up for me. So this is called Museum Visitor Coda. A single can of Zyklon B on a marble pedestal in a white room, no other objects herein, itself epitome of 20th century Germany, its supreme artifact, industrial beauty with which perfection achieves its name in the burst lungs of evil Jews. The lovely child Rachel, for instance, here seen standing in line, clutching her stiff bear, that in the gas clawed free of her. She held her bear as tightly as she could, but in the gas her bear clawed free of her. So it was interesting to me. I mean, with a couple of lines to go, I was feeling that stanza completing itself, and I hadn't intended or known that it would happen, but then the girl from the other poem showed up again, and this time she has a name. Once more, Museum Visitor Coda. It's as though Rachel now will visit this museum. And the coda is, I know little about music, but it's a musical term, of course, and this is like a coda to the other poem, and I hope someday to get it into the book. A single can of Zyklon B on a marble pedestal in a white room, no other objects herein, itself epitome of 20th century Germany, its supreme artifact, industrial beauty with which perfection achieves its name in the burst lungs of evil Jews. The lovely child Rachel, for instance, here seen standing in line, clutching her stiff bear, that in the gas clawed free of her. She held her bear as tightly as she could, but in the gas her bear clawed free of her. So my relationship with that new poem now, for example, is just to keep saying it to myself again and again and again, seeing that I have the right rhythms. I cut out a word even this morning and, telescoped it until it seems to be inevitable and not need me at all to talk about it. A compact expression of its theme.
I have a question, a sort of broad question about this poem and about MacLeish's line. You've been writing and publishing these poems for over 30 years, and you say, whenever you think you're done, and even you want to be done, and they reappear. Do you feel as though that the poems are trying to sort of finish saying what hasn't been said in previous poems or previous books? That, you keep closing a book, but it keeps sort of springing open on your lap somehow.
Yeah.
That MacLeish's line, the poem finishes itself, that maybe, is it possible that over 30 years, it's a different way to think about it, but, that over 30 years, the poems are saying, "Bill, we're not finished
Not
yet."
done yet. Yes. Well, that's Ralph, that's a good and a complex question. That's why I find myself at readings of Holocaust poetry, whether I read 3 or 4 or whether I read 6 or 8. I'm always uncomfortable because I feel as though those poems need other poems to fill out the whole say. So it could be psychologically that a new poem will show up, and if I'm lucky, intuitively, it will wedge itself within this whole complex saying that the book becomes, or that the collected poems become. Almost on the same subject, I want to say this because it's evoked by something you said. I want to feel, of course, that these poems are choosing me, not that I'm choosing them. I would feel sort of unclean in a way if I thought I were reaching for a sensational subject with which I've had some success. So now, maybe after a dream or after some reading I've done, or after some long unconscious dwelling on something, one of these poems will show up. This one, Museum Visitor Coda, I mean, I'd read that thing in Raoul Hilberg. I don't remember now whether a day had gone by or 2 days had gone by, but apparently in me there was something that wouldn't let go of it, and here it came. And then at the end, I don't remember where the poem The Bear came from. I don't remember where I read about that incident. There are many incidents like that. The Nazis, the Germans, providing toys to these children to keep them quiet before they killed them for convenience's sake. These were very thoughtful technicians, these murderers. So, but something in me at the end made her a child with a name, but I didn't know she'd show up in that poem. So, William Stafford, who has sat in this studio, says that the poetry is not so much a matter of having something to say, but of entering a process whereby discovery might be made. And I think of poetry as discovery, the writing of it as discovery. What do I have inside myself? What of the unconscious hasn't been said? Well, maybe by pursuing a story in a rhythmical way, in an imagistic way, maybe something can be said that hasn't been said.
You've said many times that some of your poems you write very quickly, that you come and just write it, but you've also said, I've been my whole life writing that poem. It's not a sudden revelation, it's the culmination of an awful lot that's gone before.
Well, I think so. I always told the students in my classes that if you write a poem within the next 5 minutes, you didn't write that poem in 5 minutes. You've spent your whole life writing that poem, or you wouldn't have been using those particular rhythms, those images. You've been dwelling on something and it's come forth. So a writer is always writing, we hear, day and night, 24/7.
It seems in this last poem, the imagery is so sharp and so complete. When you read this poem in class, and my first response to it was that we're standing, we're hearing you. It is accumulation of a lifetime's focus, allowing your subconscious to work on this material, becoming sharper, more and more refined and more powerful as you go on. This latest poem is tremendous. And
thank you, Dana. And again, what really interests me now, someone says that vowels are more emotional than consonants, and what's happening there with that Cyclone B and epitome, 20th century Germany, industrial beauty.
yeah,
I mean, all the word free shows up, and tightly. I mean, so William Stafford says he has a clue to forward motion in poetry, and much of it has to do with sounds. So I don't want to dominate a poem with my upper mind. If I want to use my upper mind in a very clear and logical way, I'll write an editorial or an essay about Holocaust poetry, something like that. But if I want to enter that process whereby discovery might be made, it's going to have to be by way of these sounds that evoke the unconscious.
right, exactly.
I remember your saying that with some of your poems, you don't really understand them, and that if you do understand them, you feel either it's been a bad reading or a bad poem, and the end leaves you uncertain.
I think this is not just true of my poetry, but all poetry. So it's not something of the upper mind. And imagine we read a poem by John Donne now, or by William Blake, or by Walt Whitman, and there still seems to be so much within it that we can't quite enunciate. Well, what does that mean about the medium itself? Language is slippery, language is evocative, language is deep. The dream of any poem, and I don't even like this phrase, but I think Galway Connell said, the dream of any poem is to reach a symbolic language. What is a symbol? Yeats says we can never exhaust the meanings of a symbol. It's not just a sign, one thing equaling one thing. It continues to give off its meanings. Frost said that, a poem continues to give off its smells like a handful of pennies, I think he said, something like that, always. So yes, if I understand one of my poems completely, then it's very limited in a bad poem, or I'm not being a good reader. At the same time, I want to be intelligible. Wallace Stevens says poetry must resist the intelligence almost successfully. So all of us who write will be somewhere along that line. Do we want our poems to resist the intelligence successfully, almost successfully, or to be completely intelligible on every level?
So I guess, I guess you're really starting to address the question that you brought up at the very beginning, Peter, about why write poetry about the Holocaust and why read it. Because we live in, this sort of multimedia age, books and films and testimonials and, archives, museums, and so much material, and material that you two, of course, know intimately. So poetry, you're suggesting, I think, gives us a perspective, gives us a way into the history of this cataclysm in human history that maybe other accounts don't.
I think so.
Yeah.
Poetry and all the arts. I mean, let's think about sculpture and painting and poetry and music. The Native American writer Jamaica Highwater says, in the end, facts cannot teach us. Facts cannot convince us. We can't finally learn from facts. To gain a communicative access to anything, we have to have an aesthetic relationship with it, whatever that means, a very complex idea. But an aesthetic relationship with the material, with the Holocaust. I read books and I aspire sometimes to the scholarly mind. I remember all I can. But in the end, it seems to me what is going to continue to make the Holocaust memorable and crucial for us is the way the arts keep it in front of us all the time as a new learning experience, something like that.
The power of poetry is, for the moment when you deeply get into a poem, it becomes your experience on a certain level. It may not be the experience that the author intended, but you internalize it and you feel it and you know it from the inside out. Therefore, the Holocaust experience, it's so easy to push away from you the words and the statistics and even the pictures, but poetry, that becomes your experience. And so the little girl with the bear isn't someone out there, it's someone inside of you. And in order for the Holocaust to be truly remembered and the powerful force that it must be for the development of mankind, it has to be, on a certain level, a real experience to each and every one of us. Granted, we will never know what the survivors went through, but poetry and art will take us closest to truly knowing what that experience was. And to me, that's, absolutely invaluable.
The statistics are impossible to accept.
Right.
You know, 6.5 million dead. You can't imagine that.
comprehend it.
They showed a documentary of the liberation of the concentration camps over Europe in 1946. And that was our first real revelation as to what went on. But I don't remember anybody discussing that because it was too awful. I
big.
begin my class with the liberation tapes. But this is to tell my class, this is what this course is about. The material is horrible. It shocks them profoundly, and then I think they forget it. But then they read Bill's poem, The Liberation Films, and it comes back. So the poem is communicating in ways which a film full of horror and corpses and unspeakable things doesn't, because we turn off.
Right.
And Bill's poem, The Liberation Films, it shows us, look, 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 and asks a question, and that stays with my students. Could I ask you to read that?
Let me make one or two more points, Peter, about some of the things we've brought up now. I want to increase the pressure on poetry itself as a means of expressing something about the Holocaust. I mean, for one thing, there is that famous statement by Theodor Adorno, nach Auschwitz ein Gedicht zu schreiben ist barbarisch. He says that after Auschwitz, poetry is a barbarian activity, or only a barbarian would write poetry. So there is that. I mean, the nature of Holocaust poetry and art itself is to call itself into question. I mean, it can almost seem obscene to be dealing with the materials of art in terms of this theme. Counter, and I understand that Adorno changed his mind to a certain extent at the end of his life, and he said that people, after all, have to express themselves. But the Nobel Prize-winning poet Czesław Miłosz says, anyone who would use the sufferings of others to attack poems, painting, art, is a demagogue. So there's that side of it. I don't want an argument, one on either side. I think it's the very nature of the activity itself to call itself into question all the time. So this is, and I was reading this morning, this is from Langer's book, Lawrence Langer's book, Preempting the Holocaust. He's talking about contemporary poetry, poetry after atrocity. A poem can no longer balance through its achieved form the void of discord that recent history seems to offer us. There's a new dimension operating here now. A poem can no longer balance through its achieved form the void of discord that recent history seems to offer us. So even when I'm trying to achieve a form, I think the poem The Bear achieves a kind of form. I mean, it's almost obscene in its lyrical beauty, so to speak. But in the gas, her bear clawed free of her. I mean, there's a lot of horror going on in that line that is like an explosive within the line of that poem, I think. Again, once more, a poem can no longer balance, So I'm thinking of all pre-Holocaust poetry can no longer balance through its achieved form the void of discord that recent history seems to offer us. And I think now it's the burden of every poem to recognize this, even as it's trying to get itself said. I mean, it's every poem is moving towards silence, in Elie Wiesel's terms, even while it's having its say, something like that. Wiesel mentions a rabbi who was silent even when speaking. Complex idea, this idea of Holocaust silence. I want to stop talking and just shut up about this. It extinguishes the mind. At the same time, it wouldn't be the right thing either for us not to witness and to talk about this, think about this, try to honor the dead. The Holocaust is sacred, as Wiesel and so many others have said. It belongs to the dead. It belongs to the survivors. And by the way, of course, the term Holocaust survivor may itself be an oxymoron. Holocaust poetry might be an oxymoron. But it belongs to those folks. And we're sort of looking in over the shoulder of this history and trying to honor it, but not gloss it over, not make it less than it was. Just to center the darkness here, if I could find that one quotation from, here it is. This is Elie Wiesel in A Jew Today, just so we know exactly what we're talking about. If you have not grasped it until now, it is time you did. Auschwitz signifies death, total death, of man and of mankind, of reason and of the heart, of language and of the senses. Auschwitz is the death of time, the end of creation. Its mystery is doomed to stay whole, inviolate. I mean, there's no escape from that. It's like it's a black hole. And yet we're human beings and we keep talking and we say, but. Auschwitz is the death of time. Langer and others talk so often about how we have had a human myth of progress, that eventually we're going to evolve toward the light, that our whole history as human beings is a process of redemption. Toward what? Togetherness, love. But Auschwitz signifies otherwise, a different kind of time.
Well, the facts are unacceptable. Many, many stories are simply too painful for us to listen to. I understand that when the survivors came to America, nobody wanted to listen to their stories. So they closed up, like Angie. Nobody wanted to hear me, so I didn't talk about it for 50 years. Well, I understand the impulse. I don't want to hear any more. I don't want to read any more. Also, as Susan Sontag said, the Holocaust is opaque. There are no easy answers, but we have to ask questions. And if the Holocaust just becomes statistics in a history book, then it's dead and meaningless. And the only way these terrible truths are acceptable is through art.
May I read a poem called The Candle on this theme? That the theme is that we want to resist, and yet we need to enter this material at the same time. The Candle. It would do me no good to travel to Auschwitz. It would do the dead no good, nor anyone else any good. It would do me no good to kneel there, me nor anyone else alive or dead any good at all. I've heard that in one oven a votive candle whispers its flame. When I close my eyes, I can see and feel that candle, its pitch aura, its tongues of pitch luminescence licking the oven's recesses. A survivor, 40 years later, crawled up into an oven and lay down. What of his heart? Could it keep pumping its own pitch light here where God's human darkness grew darkest? Whoever you were, please grant me dispensation. Rudolf Hess praised the efficiency of these ovens. It would do me no good to travel to Auschwitz, to kneel or lie down. It would do me or God or anyone else alive or dead, or anyone else neither alive nor dead, no good at all. The survivor did crawl back out of the oven. He took his heart with him, didn't he not? It kept beating. He left his heart in the oven, and it keeps beating. Black, 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 the candle of the camps. Eyes closed, staring up into this, eye beams of pitch luminescence, and the pulse of it, the heart, the candle. You and I, haven't we not, have met him, the one who lay himself down there where the Nazis had missed some. Welcome, welcome home. We have spoken the candle heart of the camps. It does the dead no good, nor us any good, doesn't it not? But it keeps black, black, its watch of pitch light, and will, any good at all, wouldn't we not, the candle?
The origin of that poem was the actual incident of a survivor going back and climbing it into the oven and lying there. That started you off.
That's it. I saw the film. Yeah,
But
saw it on television.
To me, I keep thinking about, Sontag and Wiesel. The Holocaust is opaque, and I think that's right. But I also think it's not right. And I think that your poem both, suggests both things, that there is a candle, that a man, a survivor, can crawl into the oven and crawl out again with his heart still beating, and yet leave his heart there, that there's this complex ambiguity in your poems that I think the only way to come to terms with something that is as completely ineffable as the Holocaust is to recognize the inability of, for art or anything else to really come to terms with it. And so, Adorno, I guess I can appreciate a sensibility that suggests, there's something about the Holocaust, where art shouldn't tread. And yet, what else do we have except some kind of language to try and understand something that we can never understand?
I always want to ask Bill about those double negatives.
Right.
I think he uses them 3 times in that poem.
Yeah.
Why?
Or, the double negatives in that poem, or at the end of the others, at the end of several poems in Show or Train and other poems, where you as the speaker step in and suggest, let me see if I can just find this, 45.
It happens at the end of the Catbird, too.
And the end of the Catbird also,
right? I
right?
have definite memory
Yeah.
in writing the candle that it came quickly and naturally.
Yeah.
And the English teacher in me did not, when I was revising, scratch out those double negatives. I want to trust the unconscious.
I say stand up and sit with the others, but I don't, and I do.
And I do. That's right from Anne Royfey. She uses that. Yeah, interesting. But the job of a poem is to complicate things, and maybe a double negative is a way to do this, or a triple negative, just going back and forth. Just Ralph, I appreciated what you said very much, and that's exactly where we all stand. There is an opacity to this mystery of iniquity that we call the Holocaust, and at the same time, as human beings, we want to keep trying to peer through, to see into it, to understand it. But we can never make empirical sense out of it. 1 + 1 = 2. We can't. It's too baffling. These people were baffling to themselves.
Well, in Simple Truths, which I rather hope to get you to read, it begins with a student of the Holocaust, not a survivor, not a Jew, just somebody reading the history and trying to find facts as a basis for discovering what's it all about. And in the last part of the poem, which is just one long sentence, Bill says the persona, the speaker, loses it and becomes incoherent. And I always feel that that's wrong. That the persona he becomes difficult but not incoherent. And it's rather like the madness in Lear. He may be mad, but he's making perfect sense. So why? And the end of the poem suggests how it is. And that poem, which is a very dark poem, suggests a hope. Bill writes our oceanic ignorance of ourselves. So the opposite of that, to learn about ourselves and accept it. Would you?
I have it right in front of me here, and I'll read it fairly fast to get it within our conversation. The speaker begins in almost truistic terms, I think, just trying to keep his sanity. Simple truths. When a man has grown a body to carry with him through nature for as long as he can, When this body is taken from him by other men and women who happen to be, this time, in uniform, then it is clear he has experienced an act of barbarism. And when a man has a wife to love for as long as he lives, when this wife is marked with a yellow star and driven into a chamber she will never leave alive, then this is murder. So much is clear. And when a woman has hair, when her hair is shorn and her scalp bleeds, when a woman has children to love for as long as she lives, when the children are taken from her, when a man and his wife and their children are put to death in a chamber of gas, or with pistols at close range, or are starved, or beaten, or injected by the thousands, or ripped apart by the thousands, by the millions, it is clear that where we are is Europe in our century, during the years from 1935 to 1945, after the death of Jesus, who spoke of a different order, but whose Father, who is our Father, if he is our Father, if we must speak of him as Father, watched and witnessed and knew. And when we remember, when we touch the skin of our own bodies, when we open our eyes into dream or within the morning shine of sunlight, and remember what was taken from these men, from these women, from these children, gassed and starved and beaten and thrown against walls and made to walk the valley of knives and ice picks and otherwise exterminated in ways appearing to us almost beyond even the maniacal human imagination, then it is clear that this is the German Reich during approximately 10 years of our Lord's time. And when we read a book of these things, when we hear the names of the camps, when we see films of the bulldozed dead or the film of one boy struck on the head with a club in the hands of a German doctor who will wait some days for the boy's skull to knit and will enter the time in his ledger and then take up the club to strike the boy again and wait some weeks for the boy's skull to knit and enter the time in his ledger again and strike the boy again, and so on, until the boy who, at the end of the film of his life, can hardly stagger forward toward the doctor, does die, and the doctor enters exactly the time of the boy's death in his ledger. When we see these things, or read them, then it is clear to us that this happened, and within the Lord's allowance, this work of his minions, his poor, vicious, dumb German victims twisted into the swastika shapes of trees struck by lightning on this his earth, if he is our Father, if we must speak of him in this way, this presence above us, within us, this mover, this first cause, this spirit, this curse, this bloodstream and brain current, this unfathomable oceanic ignorance of ourselves, this automatic electric Aryan swerve, this fortune that you and I were not the victims, this luck that you and I were not the murderers, this sense that you and I are clean and understand, this stupidity that gives him breath, gives him life as we kill them all, as we kill them all. So there's a poem as I was writing it that got away from me, I think. It just entered this hypnagogic stream.
Well, I want to draw attention to the last line, as we kill them all, as we killed them all. And why not as we killed them all, as we kill them all? Why in that sequence?
Well, see, the why is like a question of intention, but the question that has to be put to a poem is what does the poem do and say? Now, you've just brought up a complexity for me. I don't have an answer to it right now. This is as much your poem now as it is mine. This is probably 20 years old. What is going on here? This stupidity that gives him breath, gives him life, as we kill them all, as we kill them all. So in what sense does this speaker feel that we're continuing to kill these people as we once killed them? So I have to become a good reader of this poem. But I know that I trust these kinds of raving poems sometimes more than I do the ones that are straightforward and lay themselves out in terms that they themselves can understand. There's something going on here that maybe he's gone mad at the end.
But it's a reminder that the genocide of the Holocaust isn't something that finished in 1945
Exactly.
or 1946. It continues. Our hatred of the other is such that genocide is alive and well, and we know that. So as we kill them all, and our impulse is to say, not I,
Right, they
I'm
did.
clean, you know, I never had anything to do with it, it was them. And therein lies the problem.
Yes.
And in that poem, why the speaker makes perfect sense is he moves from out there, the simple truths, to within himself. Me, our unfathomable oceanic ignorance of ourselves.
Right.
See, I do believe in that, but we have to realize, too, we're treading on very dangerous moral ground here. On the one hand, we want to understand, as Dana has said, as we've all said, that we might be ourselves participants. If I'd been born in 1920 in Berlin instead of 1940 in Brooklyn, I might have aspired to the SS. So yes, I think I have within me the possibility of monstrous actions, but we have to make the point again and again, and many Holocaust writers talk about this, that there were the innocent victims and there were the murderers. And you're not a murderer until you murder. So I want to understand myself, but at the same time I just don't want to say something obscene like, well, the victims, if the shoe had been on the other foot, something else would have happened. We have to be very careful here about this. But what in my unconscious is going to evoke these questions and shed some light on them? That's where the poem might come in. You've heard me, one of my favorite quotes from all of literature is from Emerson. He says, "Form always stands in dread of power. What the devil will he do next?" So there I am trying to create a form on the page, or the painter is creating a form, or the composer is creating a form. But what will power do to that? What will the unconscious do? Blam! Anything can happen at that point.
And isn't that something that makes your poems, ideally, I think, sort of bigger than what they are? I mean, I think that there's a danger in writing poems. You said this early on about the Holocaust. A danger in writing about a potentially sensational subject. Right. And a lot of the poetry that was written about Vietnam, for example, Robert Bly's poetry, Levertov's poetry. There's a lot of criticism about that poetry, and I think a lot of those poems won't be around for very long because they have a kind of historical resonance about them. You know, that is dated early on. I mean, there's some fabulous poems written about Vietnam. I think that will be with us for a long time, but I think there are many, many poems that won't. And the end of the poem you just read, I think, takes these simple truths and really opens them up to become this kind of universal question about,
Exactly.
Who are we in this story? As the Holocaust recedes further and further into the past, what is it that we're really talking about?
Yeah.
The guy says, poor, vicious, dumb German victims
Right.
twisted into the swastika shapes of lightning, by the Lord. I mean, that's strange. And I mean, I can't get my mind around that, but that's what came pouring out of me as I wrote it. And I don't want to censor myself very much. I mean, I want to stay on top of the process and pretty much know what's going on in a poem. But at the other hand, I want the poem to resist me.
When you write of the Lord in riddle, or in the now we know, Lord, now we know, you capitalize it. Whereas in simple truths, it's lowercase, Lord. And it seems to me that what happens is the Lord becomes the Führer, that it's Hitler who has become God and who's made of his ignorant, dumb victims this. And it's that acknowledgement that's also our unfathomable oceanic ignorance of ourselves. Yeah. We stand by and do nothing, and we think that the evil is out there. That when I was interviewing Henry Silberstern, who encountered Dr. Mengele, whom you refer to in that poem, and I said to Henry, would you think of Mengele as the quintessence of evil? He said, oh no, no, no. He was capable of all sorts of acts of kindness. He liked the gypsy children. He had candy in his pockets. But evil, yes. I don't know, Henry said, how he was able to do what he did and live apparently as a normal human being. I don't know how the Nazis and the camps could go from the horrors of Auschwitz back to their own families. But that darkness lies within us. And it's that recognition that it seems to me is the point that you're making. And until we recognize that, we haven't understood.
All I can say is I agree. You know, I was reading Lawrence Lange again, and he says there are two different ways of looking at this, as people have, that these Nazis who killed people during the day and then went back to their families and had dinner and listened to Beethoven, well, did they have sort of a double life that they kept separate? And Lange argues, even though people have said that, no, it wasn't that at all. It's that they were fulfilling their lives completely in doing what they did during the day.
Yeah.
This was the result of their Aryan education, what they had learned. So no, it was the same person and same personality, the one who believes in the family and the one who believes in killing these people to get them out of the way. So.
It seems to me, in teaching the Holocaust, we have to find hope. If there's nothing but darkness, why bother teaching it? Why make our students study it? What's the point if there is no hope? But we have to have hope. In Bill's poems, I'm always looking for light. And one of the poems that I find expresses this is Catbird.
This is the last poem in Shoah Train. It's called Catbird. The speaker begins worried that he's going to forget. Another thick book of testimonies. I knew I could not remember them all. It was as though the survivors were moving past me in a line, and I were choosing among them, that way to oblivion, this way into a poem with my rhythmic baton. But this spring morning a catbird sang outside my door while I was reading, while Rabbi Solomon H. remembered his son, a 9-year-old who had, Solomon tells us, half the book of Psalms by heart. When he was taken to be murdered, he was saying the Psalms from memory. Just before being gassed, the boy said, I am still going to pray to God. Maybe at the last moment we will still be saved. And I looked up, and, as catbirds will, this one kept singing like crazy. Its song losing track of its beginning, never the melodies of final meanings, but going on as though nothing within its own singing could ever not remember everything. Just a few points, and then I'd like to read it again. This idea, the boy says, I am still going to pray to God, maybe at the last moment we will still be saved. It's terribly important for us all, as many Holocaust writers have said, not to condemn the covenant by which the victims died. It's up to the dead to deny God, their God. It's not up to us to do that. So I'm worried about that sometimes in some of my poems where I accuse God. I have to be very careful about that. Listen to how the speaker almost turns himself into a kind of Mengele. I didn't know that I did that. It was as though the survivors were moving past me in a line. Look how self-conscious he is. That rose into me. And I were choosing among them. He uses the phrase, my rhythmic baton. It was the fad of the German officer corps to use a conductor's musical baton. Imagine the obscenity of that. There's more background to this poem that I won't go into, but this phrase, the most important phrase in the poem maybe, in terms of everything we've been talking about, that is taking an unblinking view of what is going on here, and not finding any light when there isn't any, but still striving toward some way for us to continue and believe in ourselves as human beings. The phrase, as though. I mean, the most optimistic thing I've ever read about the Holocaust is that many of those murderers who were members of the Einsatzgruppe in Poland and killed people by the tens of thousands, many of these convinced idealists, inheritors of the German academic tradition, needed to drink heavily, and many of them killed themselves. So even though they were taught that it was right to kill all of these people, in the end, many of them couldn't bear it and killed themselves, or drank themselves into stupor and couldn't get over it. This says something good about the human personality in the end. If we would just allow our humaneness to come through, maybe. But here I am again, preempting the darkness of the Holocaust. Catbird. Another thick book of testimonies. I knew I could not remember them all. It was as though the survivors were moving past me in a line, and I were choosing among them, that way to oblivion, this way into a poem with my rhythmic baton. But this spring morning a catbird sang outside my door while I was reading, while Rabbi Solomon H. remembered his son, a 9-year-old who had, Solomon tells us, half the book of Psalms by heart. When he was taken to be murdered, he was saying the Psalms from memory. Just before being gassed, the boy said, I am still going to pray to God. Maybe at the last moment we will still be saved. And I looked up and, as catbirds will, this one kept singing like crazy, its song losing track of its beginning, never the melodies of final meanings, but going on as though nothing within its own singing could ever not remember everything.
Bill, thank you very much. Dana Logston, thank you very much. Rolf Black, thank you very much.